Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons back with another D&D Reacts video, this time going back to Arbiter of Worlds, who is going to put forth the ultimate question: should there be evil races inherently in your world or in your game? So, of course, we all know my thoughts on this. I've mentioned it before that I'm actually kind of an alignment junkie when it comes to the Dungeons and Dragons system. I'm very fond of that system. Even without that system, I'm fond of kind of using it as a background system, and that definitive good and evil are definitely something that should be there, and that they do kind of represent real world philosophies anyway, even outside of an objective good and evil. But there most definitely should be evil races, at least in my opinion. But let's see what he has to say with regards to this.
Welcome to episode 23 of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, hello. Here at Arbiter of Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. So let's get into it. The question before us today is an important one. Should your fantasy tabletop RPG campaign have innately evil races? Should orcs be evil? Yes. Okay, fine. We will drill deeper. Honestly, I think most of you watching the video genuinely do know the answer is that simple, but it remains a perennial topic of debate among the extremely online. Therefore, I'm going to do something I never do, which is make a simple thing complicated for the sake of better gaming.
I have to applaud him for the complete deadpan delivery of that, because even from just the one video I've reacted to and the few others that I've looked into, he loves to make the simple complicated, and so do I. So I'd be a hypocrite if I lambasted him for that. But I do have to applaud the self-aware deadpan response there, and the classic just saying yes and then going straight to the end credits. Because let's face it, yes, there should absolutely, should orcs be inherently evil? Absolutely. If we want to go back and take this to its roots, orcs as we know it, particularly fantasy orcs, are from, they have Tolkienian origins. They are from J.R.R. Tolkien. And yes, at the very end, he kind of had a position of they should be like redeemable to a certain extent because of the Christian theology that is in Lord of the Rings, that there's basically nothing that is truly irredeemable. But the understanding of what an orc was, it was literally a satanic corruption of the elven race. That's how orcs came about. They were the twisted, corrupted version, tortured by Melkor to become orcs. So they were an inherent perversion of the good of Eru Ilúvatar's creation of the elves, of the firstborn. That's what orcs were. Same thing with trolls. Trolls were a perversion of Yavanna's Ents. So, yeah, they were inherently evil because they were forged by torturing, breaking, and corrupting a race into something alien to what it was, in mockery of something that was good. But let's go into the more open, non-Tolkienian philosophy and see what the Arbiter of Worlds has to say on this.
Let's return to the question. Should your fantasy tabletop RPG campaign have innately evil races? More specifically, should orcs be evil? To answer those questions, there's three different factors we need to consider. What is a fantasy race? What is innate evil? And why should you include innately evil races? Let's start with what is a fantasy race. In my best-selling and incredibly compelling book, By This Axe, which is on sale now in the links below, I wrote the following. Since J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, fantasy worlds have had races. In Middle-earth, the races were man, elf, dwarf, hobbit, ent, or control. Tolkien's races were translated virtually one-to-one into Dungeons & Dragons during the 1970s, and from there metastasized into every other role-playing game in most video games. Along the way, some halflings got renamed, hello halflings, some races got split into sub-races like dark elves and mountain dwarves, and lots of new races got introduced, including some that became so popular as to dominate a lot of contemporary play. For a while, virtually every RPG, CRPG, and MMORPG on the planet had you select a race alongside a class as the formative choice you made when creating a character. But despite this abiding popularity, race has begun to go out of favor with some contemporary circles of the role-playing game community. In some venues, in fact, the term has become so weaponized that its primary use is as a cudgel in online arguments.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% true. People have become, like, one of the big problems is political ideology in particular has become it's become the measuring sticks, it's become the shorthand for literally everything, and especially on the left. Now, this is not, the right is not immune to this, but especially on the left, control of language is the dominant zeitgeist. That is their entire identity is wrapped up in control of language. And they've taken that word and they can't leave it alone. Like that's the biggest thing that I would think that comes from this issue, is that those who are politically and socially to the right or politically and socially conservative are a lot better at doing what I call putting it on the branch. This is something I teach my sales staff at work because I do a lot of sales training as part of my job. And I tell them, I'm like, hey, what you have to do is you got to find a branch on a tree outside the office. Take your problems, take your personal beliefs and your views and stuff, take them off like a jacket, hang them on the branch before you walk in. And then when you walk back out at the end of the day, you can take them off that branch and change it and put it back on. It's like being Mr. Rogers. When you step in, you have to take off your sweater and put it in the closet, change your shoes, put them in the closet, put on your loafers, put on your other sweater, sit down, be Mr. Rogers, then get up and change back and go back out into the real world. Now, this doesn't mean you don't take your values or your convictions or stuff. It's not saying that you become a hypocrite or that you act radically outside your values or whatever while you're there. But like when you walk into the tabletop role-playing game and you sit down at the TTRPG table, you are all tacitly agreeing. Every person there is tacitly agreeing to two major things. One, we are operating in a fantasy world, and that fantasy world is not real and does not have a bearing on the real world and does not reflect the real world. We are existing here to separate ourselves and have some relief from real life while we're here. And the second tacit agreement that you are making when you sit down at the TTRPG table is that you are going to accept everything that comes out in the best possible light. As we used to say, one of those rules that men wish women knew: if we say something and it can be taken two ways, and one way is fine and the other way makes you feel hurt or angry or sad, we've meant the first one. When you sit down and I say, okay, that's an evil race, you are to take it in, okay, even if it's not entirely evil, you are to take it to mean that this race is predominantly evil and performs evil behavior or is corrupted by some kind of extra planner or magical source that makes them behave in an evil manner, and that we have a definition of evil that we're using and agreeing on. Not that I am pushing some philosophy that different skin tones or different flavors of human are inherently evil through the use of that language. You are agreeing that when something is presented in the game, It is to be given the benefit of the doubt that it is presented within the context of that game and in a light that is not meant to be offensive or radical or transgressive. It is meant to be something that is reflective of that world. That's what you're agreeing to when you sit down. But unfortunately, you have this large sect of the population. Their entire identity is wrapped up in this. Everything that there is no actual person there. There is no real personality. There's no true conviction. There's no true personal belief system or morality that are in these people. They are all tied to whatever it is to their pet causes. And since that is their entire identity, they can't leave it at the door, and everything is an attack on that identity within the game. That's where you come across this kind of bullshit where we need to change race to species because we don't want to use the word race because it's problematic that it might imply this. No, it doesn't, because it doesn't go outside the game. It doesn't transmit into the real world. No philosophy in the game reflects the real world. That is one of the agreements that you make when you sit down. And then that's just how it is. And good and evil, there is an objective morality in these games that's there. And there's a lot of shorthand that's there where it's like, this doesn't apply to every situation, but it's a good shorthand and you accept that when you sit down. They can't do that because they have to do this. Well, there's no real good and evil, and alignment is flawed because, you got to be able to take all of this real world false nuance into account in the game. All right, ran over. Let's get back to what he has to say about innately evil races.
Let's put aside the partisan cruft. In a fantasy RPG, a race is nothing more than a species within the same genus as the human species. It might be a species that's so closely related to Homo sapiens that it can interbreed with humanity to produce fertile offspring, just as a brown bear and a polar bear can. It might be a more distant cousin where interbreeding is possible but results in sterility, as between a donkey and a horse. But if we were horses, our fantasy races would be donkeys, onagers, mountain zebras, and plain zebras. If we were polar bears, our fantasy races would be black bear and brown bear. If we were dogs, our fantasy races would be coyote, gray wolf, red wolf, golden jackal, and so on. Now, because a fantasy race is a distinct species from humanity, albeit a closely related one, it often gets used as a proxy for the concept of species as a whole. So someone might speak of the race of centaurs, even though centaurs are clearly not homos. Centaurs are clearly not members of Homo sapiens. And that's fine. The word species sounds very scientific, and sometimes that feels out of place in a fantasy RPG. At the same time, it's also fine to just use the word species.
Just going to take a second on that little joke there. They're clearly not homos. They're clearly not Homo sapiens. Okay. That's a good test right there. If you felt your eyes get narrow and your eyebrows drop and you started to feel that rage, that righteous indignation swelling up in your chest when he said they're not homos, that is where you are breaching that agreement that is made as being part of the table, That is immediately saying, I am choosing to not take this in the most innocent light possible. I am choosing to assume the most offensive. Setting aside the fact that that is just a recipe for a miserable life where you will not find any happiness or contentment whatsoever, and you will live in a state of perpetual rage and discontent until you give yourself a stroke and a heart attack at the same time over somebody using a word that you innocently using a word you disagree with or you've attached some extra meaning to. Setting all that aside, what you basically guaranteed is that you will eventually destroy every single group you're part of. You will ruin the fun of every single game you're part of because your need to do that, your need to immediately feel offended or disrespected or indignant from something as simple as somebody saying they're not homos and immediately jumping to, oh my God, homo, that's a slur for gay people, as opposed to homo as in Homo erectus, Homo sapien, any of the various different hominid species there. Your decision to do that means you have decided that there will eventually be a trigger that ruins the game for you, and then you will turn and ruin it for everybody else.
I don't begrudge anyone who prefers one word or the other. It's just a semantic indicator of meaning. The meaning is what matters. Whatever you call them, the important point is that the word race in a fantasy world does not mean the same thing as the word race in the context of US Census data. The different fantasy races are distinct species. More importantly, they are not stand-ins for Earth's human races. And we can be certain of that because we know that fantasy races are stand-ins for something else. They are stand-ins for the rival hominids with which the human species struggled for dominance during the evolutionary adaptive period. Population genetics has proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that during the prehistoric era in which our species evolved, we were confronted by the existence of many other sapient hominids, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and many others. Now,
I'm going to go ahead and give him credit for saying, hey, that this is actually a really clever take on this. I'm pretty sure I read somewhere an article or something that was written kind of on this philosophy, that it goes back to interspecies and interracial conflict for resources among prehistoric hominids, and there is some evidence that may link old oral traditions back to the memory of those kind of struggles. I'm not entirely sure that I buy into that 100%, but it is definitely a clever way to go about it. And it's a good way to explain the entire situation. It's like you said, words are semantic. This is a semantic representation of a meaning. And part of that thing I was saying, where you made an agreement when you sat down at the table, is that we have taken an agreement that these words are going to be used in a specific context and mean things in a certain way within the game world when we use them, even if it's a word that, say, has multiple different meanings and multiple different uses in regular everyday life. And it's important. Just like, and I'm going to use a political representation here for this American, so anybody who's outside of America, I'm sorry if it doesn't ring home the way it should. Arguments about the Second Amendment come up a lot with words like well-regulated and militia. And the whole premise that this is in support of gun control is fundamentally flawed. Because when those words were used in the context that they were written, when they were put into the Constitution, when they were debated by the founding fathers and the framers, they had an agreed upon specific meaning within that context. And the only way you get the support for gun control out of it is if you take them out of context and use other definitions for those words that were clearly not meant within that intent. You're doing the same thing when you sit down at the role-playing game table and somebody's talking about race, and you choose to assume when somebody says that, they mean black people or white people or Asian people or Mexican people, as opposed to they mean what we all say race means we mean a game mechanic that represents a different people. Okay? And you can see this. I can't remember what that girl's name is, but I can't even remember if it's actually a girl or not, but it's this Asian quote unquote pro game master that was real famous for, oh, there's no races, there's only cultures, and there's no ownership and blah, blah, blah in my game. And it's just the dumbest drivel you've ever heard. And it's all rampant hypocrisy, because it's like, all you did is say, oh, it's cultures with cultural tendencies. All you did was change the word and act like somehow you're better. You're a hypocrite. You're using the exact same mechanics. You're just trying to call it something different to make it fit your communistic worldview. Same thing here. Same point he's getting at.
12 years ago, a man named Danny Vendramini released an excellent book called Them and Us: How Neanderthal Predation Created Modern Humans. In Them and Us, Venturini made a lot of claims about Neanderthals, and at the time, his views were entirely out of step with mainstream thinking. Since then, several of his claims have been vindicated. In particular, he's turned out to be absolutely correct that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis did not live in peace and harmony. They slaughtered each other. At one point, the Neanderthals had the upper hand and the human species was reduced to the verge of extinction. Later, we humans turned the tables and exterminated the Neanderthals. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and other apologists have begun to acknowledge the bloodiness of our prehistory. But in mainstream discussion, it's presented as if we, evil human beings, murderously killed off Fred Flintstone. Not so, says Venturini. Neanderthals were nothing like Fred Flintstone. He says they were hunched, cannibalistic predators with large shining eyes and animalistic snouts, covered by thick fur and massive muscles, built for close combat, hunting by night, with a brutish guttural voice and a huge mouth with huge teeth and powerful jaws. They didn't look like Fred Flintstone. They looked like this. Neanderthals were orcs. Venturini, in fact, argues that all of the worldwide myths of goblins, orcs, ogres, onis, and so on, they're all based on the prehistorical struggle between us and Neanderthals. It's a great read. If you'd like to know more about the book Them and Us, I actually wrote an entire essay about this topic called When Orcs Were Real. I've linked it in the description below. For now, what you need to know is that when Homo sapiens encountered Homo neanderthalis, it was a struggle to the death. We won, they lost. But it could have gone the other way, and it almost did.
So he just mentioned the article and, related it back to the book. And heck, maybe it sounds like he wrote the article, so maybe we should be giving him credit for that idea. When orcs were real. Let's continue.
The reason for this deadly struggle is called the competitive exclusion principle, also known as Gauss's law. This is a law of biology, and it states that two species that compete for the same resources cannot coexist. One of the species will always overcome the other, leading the latter to suffer extinction. Gauss's law, as it happens, is the perfect framework to assess what innately evil means in the context of a fantasy world. From the point of view of a human race in a fantasy world, an innately evil race is one with which peaceful coexistence is impossible. One of the two species is going to drive the other into extinction. There is no live and let live. There's only an endless war to cause or prevent extinction. Now, the very best example of this that you'll ever see comes in the movie Aliens. The xenomorphs are a species with which our own coexistence is impossible. They compete with us for the most precious of resources, our own bodies, which they use for reproduction. Nevertheless, the humans who confront the xenomorphs split into two factions. Ellen Ripley wants to wipe them out. She says, I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. Carter Burke and the other faction says, this is clearly an important species we're dealing with, and I don't think that you or I or anybody has the right to arbitrarily exterminate them. And Ripley says, wrong. Now, nobody with a functional moral compass who watches the movie Aliens thinks Burke is the hero. He's the villain. He is willing to risk human lives for xenomorphs. Ripley is the hero because she wants to save her fellow humans by wiping out the xenomorphs. Burke is chaotic evil. Ripley is lawful good. Burke is also foolish because he wrongly thinks there might be some way to coexist with the xenomorphs. Ripley is wise because she rightly knows about the competitive exclusion principle. Humans and xenomorphs cannot coexist. One has to go extinct. I'm not exaggerating. Ripley understands this as an existential threat. She says as much in her interview with the Weyland-Yutani board. If one of those things gets down here, then that will be all, and all this bullshit that you think is so important, you could just kiss all that goodbye. Now, if Carter Burke were on RPG Twitter, he would say something like, orcs are an important species and no so-called paladin has the right to arbitrarily exterminate them. And if Ripley were on RPG Twitter, she would say, wrong, and Ripley would be correct. So when I assert that you should have innately evil races in your fantasy RPG, I'm very specifically saying that you should have races with which humanity's coexistence is as impossible as humanity's coexistence with the xenomorphs and aliens. If orcs are like the xenomorphs, you should kill them on sight. Orc juveniles, they're face huggers. Kill them with fire. Orc babies, xeno eggs. Blow them up with explosions. Don't try to raise an orc up to be a good person. It'll just grow up and eat your face. Don't try to make peace, us versus them. Now, in a fantasy world, you can add metaphysical layers to this life or death struggle. Lorehammer is very good at doing this. There's no question that the Imperium of Man is in a life or death struggle with competitive species such as Tyranids, and no one is going to negotiate a peace treaty with them. At the same time, there's deeper religious or cosmological nuances relating to gods, demons, afterlife, and the warp. All of that is great, but you don't need it. An innately evil race is simply a race with which the human race cannot coexist. So that brings us to our third and final question. Why should you have innately evil races? I'm going to offer a glib answer, and then I'm going to give a thoughtful answer. The glib answer is this. Aliens wouldn't be a space horror movie if Ripley and the alien queen were able to talk through their differences and come to a negotiated settlement for the colonization of LV-426. That would make Aliens part of a different genre, something like 80s classic Enemy Mine. Enemy Mine is a great movie, but if you want to watch a horror movie about life or death struggle with aliens, it's not the right choice. Likewise, fantasy RPGs wouldn't be traditional fantasy if there weren't life or death struggles between good and evil races. So to the extent that you want to enjoy classic and familiar gameplay, you stick with the trope. That's the glib answer.
There's also a psychological component to it as well. This is something that was very, very common throughout history, and it's still very common today. It's just kind of somewhat lied about more, and that is the dehumanization of the enemy. Enemies are dehumanized for a reason, because if we're not killing fellow human beings and other people that have families and stuff on the other side, it doesn't put us through nearly the psychological trauma that it would, knowing that the other guy in the other trench is just, fighting for home and hearth the same way we are. That's why we had all the various different things where we didn't kill Germans in World War II. We killed Krauts. We didn't kill Vietnamese or Viet Cong in Vietnam. We killed Charlies, or we killed whatever else we called them. We didn't kill, in modern wars, when you went to Afghanistan or you went to Iraq, you didn't fight humans, you fought Hajis. And all of that is to protect the psyche of the soldier. Now, how does that translate to a role-playing game sense? Well, because it allows your players, and you want to have some moralistic dilemmas and whatnot in your game sometimes to trigger that in your player. And, you want to have that kind of realism in some cases. Some cases you don't want it at all. But you don't want your players fighting over whether or not their character is doing what's right when they kill the bad guys that are in front of you. If we've got the hobgoblins that are there, the hobgoblins have no problems killing the characters and attacking the characters. There's no moral quandary there. But you don't want the players of the characters thinking back oh my God, did I kill them just because they were hobgoblins, or did they really deserve it? Of course they really deserved it. Why? Because they're hobgoblins, and hobgoblins inherently deserve it. They are a race that is going to kill us eventually, no matter what.
A thoughtful answer. So to give that answer, we need to inquire, why do so many of our pastimes revolve around vicariously experiencing life or death struggle between good and evil, in which violence is the only solution? This is not a modern phenomenon. Since the dawn of history, all of our myths, our legends, our folktales have revolved around savage struggle with existential stakes. Why? There's many answers to this question, but to me, it seems that human nature has been irrevocably marred, one might say. And maybe it was marred by that life or death struggle of our ancestors against the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and so on. But part of human nature is to be competitive, to be hostile, and to use violence to protect the interests of family or nation against those with whom peace is impossible. We didn't have that part of ourselves. If human beings were as gentle and loving as bonobos, we'd have been annihilated by cannibalistic Neanderthals. But part of human nature is to be cooperative, compassionate, to seek harmony of interest through diplomacy and trade. And in fact, it's probably the case that our superior sociability is what enabled us to triumph against stronger, faster, big brain Neanderthals. So human beings are both warriors and diplomats, both fighters and lovers. And because of that cooperative, loving aspect of human nature, there's an internal pain, there's a guilt that arises when we are hostile, when we are violent. We feel the betrayal of part of ourselves. But if we are violent towards an enemy committed to our destruction, if we are violent towards an innately evil enemy, then we feel no guilt. We feel the righteous wrath of the hero. And this is why World War II movies with Nazi villains are perennially popular. And that's why Vietnam War movies with Viet Cong villains are considered anti-war or problematic. Orcs, being innately evil, can be killed in the fantasy world, allowing us to show our warrior aspect without causing guilt from our peaceful sides. And in our 21st century world, very few of us ever have the chance to let out the warrior aspect of personality. In fact, the entirety of modern society is structured to make sure the warrior aspect of human nature is only experienced in specific socially acceptable channels such as martial arts or gaming. A young man in 9th century Norway could take sail each June in a longship to sail to distant shores and hew many foemen. A young man in 21st century Norway cannot. And that hole, that warrior-shaped gap in our experiential horizon, is what people seek to fill with entertainment, sports, movies, video games, and yes, tabletop RPGs. And filling that hole in peaceful, pro-social ways like a tabletop RPG is a very good thing. Now, critics of traditional styles of play assert that filling the hole is a bad thing. They claim they have the moral high ground, that they've risen above such things. They will assert that more sophisticated players want to experience interspecies diplomacy. They want to explore matters of moral philosophy. They want to delve into the deconstruction of notions of the other in human discourse. Bollocks. Such critics are totally missing the point. We can do all of those things in the real world. The real world provides us with endless opportunity for debate, trade, cooperation, coexistence. What the real world does not provide us is the opportunity to gnaw on our shields until we enter a seething berserk fury and can unleash red-handed mayhem on the innately evil orcs of the jutting mountains. And unless and until that situation changes, RPGs can and should continue to include evil orcs against whom we can so rage. Don't forget to righteously press the like and subscribe button so that the innately evil YouTube algorithm can be taught a lesson in pain, and then rage about this in the comments below. I'll see you next week.
So yeah, this is a good take on a lot of things. I like the social take on the back end of it, where it fills in that gap. I mean, I guess it can in a lot of ways. That is a solid take on the phenomenon, but in the end, it's absolutely right. Having clearly defined bad guys, I'll put it to another example that's another in-game example. There is a constant argument over realism and simulation when it comes to combat in games. Oh, this is that, and this needs to be that, and this is realistic, and that's not realistic. Everything is shorthand that is a balance between a fast-paced and exciting, understandable combat encounter and some degree of realism. Because, as I've said before in the past and had in different arguments, I used to be a professional kickboxer. And I can think of, just off the top of my head, 9 or 10 different opposed roles that would come into play to realistically figure out what happens when I throw a jab at my opponent's head. I throw a jab at an opponent's head, there are probably 9 opposed rolls that happen just in that jab that determine whether or not I hit, what kind of damage is done, and how it affects the fight and how it affects the opponent. Okay? And that's just off the cuff of my head. There are thousands and thousands of tiny variables that go into those exchanges. And to be truly realistic and have all that, you would never resolve anything. It'd be the most boring thing on the planet. And so the shorthand has to be in there. And you want to get in and get into the action and move through the game. You don't want to have what is in real life, and the hobgoblins attack me. My decisions are calculated. My decisions and my analysis of the situation is generally handled by the supercomputer that is my brain in a split second. I've gone through all the different quandaries and moral quandaries and different possibilities and everything to arrive at my decision in a snap. At a tabletop role-playing game, this means every time there's a potential combat encounter, we now need to break for a 45-minute philosophical discussion over whether or not we should kill them, capture them, knock them unconscious, run from them, whatever the case may be. You have to have shorthand in these games in order to maintain that, because since you are thinking for another person, in this case, you are thinking for a character. All right. You are having to take yourself, you don't have an instantaneous subconscious OODA loop that orients and makes decisions and actions in a split second. What you have is something that ends up being discussed and thought about and moralized over, et cetera, that takes considerable time, and you're doing it with multiple other people. We're just going to turn every combat into a philosophy session on that extreme. So that shorthand is extraordinarily valuable. But you need bad guys. Epic heroes need epic bad guys. And epic bad guys need to be innately evil. They don't need to be redeemable. Yes, there is a great place for the redeemable villain. I mean, that is definitely something that's there. But sometimes you just need a Dark Lord. And there was no question that Sauron was irredeemably evil. There was nothing to save or turn him back. The solution was destroy the ring, eliminate Sauron. No moralizing over whether or not Sauron really is a decent guy who's just misunderstood, and maybe we should have some negotiations and maybe turn the ring back over to him with some sanctions on Mordor. Sometimes that's what you need. And it's good for your players to know that a henchman is a henchman, a mob is a mob sometimes. Anyway, that's all I've got on this one. Tell me what you think down in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe, tell people about it. Tell me what you think, where I'm wrong, how I'm wrong. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Take care.